Finnur Dellsén from the University of Iceland. Very pleased to have you here. And talking about the glory and scandal of philosophy, abduction. Please go ahead.
Right, so I'm very sorry I couldn't be in Helsinki in person. I'm very happy to give this talk remotely. The title of my talk is Abduction, the Glory and Scandal of Philosophy. And let me just start by explaining this title a little bit. So it really comes from this quote, kind of famous quote by C.B. Broad, where he's talking on the occasion of the third centenary of Francis Bacon, and he says, "May we venture to hope that when Bacon's next centenary is celebrated, the great work which he set going will be completed, and that inductive reasoning, which has long been the glory of science, will have ceased to be the scandal of philosophy." So I take it what C.B. Broad is saying here is that inductive reasoning wasn't is, I suppose, the glory of science in the sense that scientists are routinely using various forms of inductive reasoning, and they're doing so with a great deal of success. But it's also the scandal of philosophy in the sense that philosophers of science, or epistemologists, have not yet formulated and justified adequate rules of inductive reasoning to be used in science. And now, arguably, that situation has changed somewhat. And this was written in 1926, and more or less all of the sort of most prominent accounts of inductive reasoning in science were developed after 1926. So presumably, we're in a better situation with regards to Broad's problem now. Now, what I'll argue in this talk, though, is that something analogous to what Broad thought was true of inductive reasoning in science in 1926 is true now, almost 100 years later, of abductive reasoning in philosophy. Namely that although abductive reasoning is the glory of philosophy in the sense that philosophers are routinely using various forms of abductive reasoning, and then we can argue about the extent to which they're successful in doing so, it's the scandal of philosophy as well, in the sense that philosophers have not yet formulated, let alone justified, adequate rules of abductive reasoning in philosophy. And in particular, this is going to be the main claim of the talk, really, that the standard version of inference to the best explanation, sort of assumed throughout, I think, really methodological discussions about philosophy, is not really an adequate rule in many, and most situations in which abductive reasoning is employed in philosophy. So that's going to be the main thesis. Let me talk first about the glory of science, so how abductive reasoning is in fact used and endorsed in philosophy. So, I mean, just as a matter of sociological and empirical observation, I think it's sort of obvious that philosophers have and are appealing to abductive reasoning in order to argue for their various kind of positive views. Just some examples to get you going. I mean, there's kind of abductive reasoning features very prominently in arguments for scientific realism, also in arguments for us having knowledge of the external world, for non-Humean theories of laws of nature, for the existence of abstract mathematical entities, so this is called known as Platonism, for moral realism of various kinds, and so on and so forth. I mean, I could really go on for a very long time here. If we have time, I might comment on the fact that, interestingly, abductive reasoning is also being used and has been used to argue for contrary theses, so moral anti-realism, the non-existence of abstract mathematical entities, and so on and so forth. And that's a bit of a worry, I think, for the methodology, that it sort of tends to produce whatever conclusion you're most inclined to beforehand anyway. So as I say, if you have time, I'll get back to this. So in addition to this kind of fact that philosophers are using, many of them are using something like abductive reasoning, it's also kind of, this kind of form of reasoning is also explicitly endorsed by some of the most prominent philosophers. So we have people like Laurie Paul, for example, in a sort of well-known methodological discussion of the methodology of metaphysics. She writes that it is modeling and inference to the best explanation that form the core of the metaphysical method I am defending. Gary Gutting, in a kind of an overview article about philosophical methodology and progress, reports on the currently popular idea that philosophical theories are justified as the best explanations of the data in a given domain. This kind of reporting on what people in general think in the profession. And then we have Timothy Williamson, another example, who expresses surprise at the idea that philosophy could or should get by without something like inference to the best explanation. So these are just people endorsing IDE or abductive reasoning perhaps more generally. You can find many more examples, and also, of course, in sort of private conversation with your philosophers endorsing abductive reasoning of various kinds. Now, one interesting question, I think, is why is this the case? Why have we sort of landed on abductive reasoning as sort of the default form of reasoning, at least in favor of philosophical theories? I think the answer is kind of an argument by elimination, or we arrive at this kind of by elimination. It's kind of a there is no alternative kind of argument. Because if you kind of think about deductive reasoning, first of all, you might think, well, can't we just justify our philosophical theories by deduction? The problem with that, of course, is that deductive reasoning is not amputative. It doesn't really get us to a theory that goes beyond the premises that we put into the argument. And so this really leads to a problem that David Chalmers really nicely terms the problem of premise deniability in philosophy. And here the problem is basically that, well, if you argue deductively for some theory T, you have to assume a set of premises that are logically at least as strong as the theory T, and then your opponents are just going to sort of pick whatever the premise they like least, basically, and reject that in order to reject your argument in favor of T. And you can kind of see this play out a lot in philosophy, this kind of premise denying strategy. And so for this reason, arguably, deductive reasoning is not super helpful in establishing positive general theories in philosophy. Likewise, enumerative induction, which is sort of the obvious next step, is not really going to help, I think, because enumerative induction just licenses inferences to kind of more of the same kind of conclusions. It doesn't license inference to theoretical entities or principles that would lie behind the observations or perhaps our intuitions that we base our theorizing behind. It would just amount to be basically a generalization of the intuitions or the observations that we made. It wouldn't provide any kind of deeper theory or explanation for what we're seeing or what we're intuiting. And finally, I think, can't we just do some sort of Bayesian updating? And that's sort of, in a way, that's sort of the orthodoxy in philosophy of science, is kind of a Bayesian model of reasoning. But the problem with this, as applied to philosophical reasoning in particular, is that it is not well equipped, at least at present, to deal with a priori reasoning of the sort that happens in philosophy. So it's really well equipped to deal with sort of empirical reasoning, where you receive some new evidence and then you update your credences in light of that evidence. Really well equipped with that. It really has a major problem dealing with any kind of a priori changing of the credences, where you sort of realize that, oh, in light of what I hadn't really realized was a bit of a problem, I should change my credences. And in fact, that's kind of one of the major problems with the Bayesian framework, and something we kind of view, I guess, as a kind of an idealization, or most people do. Now, in addition to that, I think even if that changes, even if we could sort of provide a sophisticated Bayesian account of a priori reasoning, I think we arguably still need some way of approximating the Bayesian ideals for mathematically limited beings such as ourselves. I mean, we don't go around kind of having precise credences, so we need some way of approximating these ideals that might be well described by the Bayesian framework. And I've argued in previous work, and some other people have as well, that actually abductive reasoning is really well suited to be this kind of approximation to ideal Bayesian reasoning. So even if we were to come up with a Bayesian story of a priori reasoning, I think we might still need, and I think we'll still need a story of abductive reasoning to be employed in philosophy as elsewhere. So that sort of lands us with this idea of abductive reasoning, perhaps, as being sort of the next logical thing to try, a fourth thing. It sort of seems like we should arrive there. And I think that's, broadly speaking, correct. But I do want to kind of make a distinction here between inference to the best explanation on the one hand and abductive reasoning more generally on the other. So I'll distinguish the two as follows. So abductive reasoning for me is going to be really any form of non-deductive reasoning in which the extent to which theories provide better explanations of one's evidence influences one's reasoning from that evidence. This is a very broad category of non-deductive reasoning, basically. What I'll call standard inference to the best explanation, or sometimes I might just slip into calling it just inference to the best explanation, because this is what the main theorists of this kind of reasoning had in mind. That's a rule of inference where if a particular theory Ti better explains the relevant evidence double struck E, this is a kind of a set of evidence, than any other available theory in some set of alternative theories, then you may defeasibly infer that theory Ti from that evidence. So let me just kind of give you a diagram of how this is supposed to work. So you have some evidence in the sort of bottom layer of this diagram. You have some theories that are available at a given time. Some of them might be your theory, and some of them might be some other person's theory, but they're available, they have been formulated. And then you sort of figure out which one provides the best explanation. I mean, they might all explain the evidence to some extent, but one of them provides the best explanation, and that's the one that you may infer according to standard IBE. I think this is kind of a quite standard story. I think it's basically what Harman had in mind, also people like Lifton, many other people. Okay, and so this is really what I'll sort of be targeting in a way in this talk as used in philosophy. So that gets us really to the scandal. So sort of problems for the standard version of inference to the best explanation as used in philosophy. And my criticism is going to be, in a way quite simple. It's going to be that, if we kind of look towards the philosophy of science and when philosophers of science have discussed, which they have done for a number of years and decades even, they've discussed this kind of rule of inference to the best explanation, the standard variety. We sort of noticed that actually this rule is quite unreliable, very unreliable in certain situations. And these situations then point to kind of three problems for using the standard inference to the best explanation, standard IBE generally. These three problems, the first one is really well known, it's called the bad lot problem. The other two I'll call the plausible rivals problem and the uncertain evidence problem. I'll sort of go through these problems and then I'll suggest some ways of avoiding them. But what I'm going to do here in this part of the talk is to just suggest that these problems, I'll sort of show you what the problems are quite generally, and then I'll suggest that these problems are at least as severe for the use of standard IBE in philosophy as they are for the use of standard IBE in science. So if we should be worried about them in science, which I think we should also be even more so worried about them in philosophy. Okay, so starting with the bad lot problem. So what is this problem? Well, it's a problem due to Bas van Fraassen. He kind of pointed out that it's the set of available explanatory theories, this set that I call double struck T. If that is not likely to contain the correct explanation to begin with, then even the best explanation in this set of available explanations will be false or will be likely to be false. So it's a very kind of simple, really logical problem. In a way, if you restricted the set of theories that are available and you're choosing between the available theories, then of course there's no guarantee that you're choosing the true theory because the true theory might be one that's not been available. And this is just, as I say, a logical problem, but I think in a more recent sort of development, people like Charles Stanford have argued that Stanford calls this the problem of unconcealed alternative. They've argued that actually the sort of historical record in philosophy, in science, suggests that sometimes, and perhaps even quite generally, and perhaps quite often, we have good historical reasons to believe that we have not yet conceived as the correct explanations of various actual concrete phenomena. Now, Stanford thinks, and he sort of argues in detail, that this is most sort of acute when theorizing is hard, basically. So occasionally theorizing is not very hard. Occasionally we can sort of just see that there are really just two options here. Maybe X causes Y, or Y causes X, or maybe there's a third option, X and Y are caused by a third factor, Z, or something like that. The theorizing there might not be very, very difficult. You can sort of just choose between these alternatives and you see what the logical space really amounts to. Now, oftentimes that's not the case. So, Stanford talks about sort of fundamental theorizing. That's the term he uses, and you can sort of think about fundamental physics, for example, where theorizing is really a large part of the sort of scientific endeavor. And coming up with the right theory is just as difficult as kind of coming up with the right experiment to test that theory. So in these kind of situations, theorizing basically requires kind of creativity, requires imagination, it requires some conceptual novelties, importantly, and it's not just sort of relatively simple or straightforward extrapolation from some data that you have. Now, I think the point that I want to make now is that this problem, if it is a problem in science, seems to be just as much of a problem in philosophy, perhaps more of a problem, because philosophical theorizing, if anything, is precisely about sort of using creativity, imagination, conceptual novelties, etc., to come up with sort of surprising theoretical alternatives. And once we have those alternatives, you might see that those are much more plausible than the ones that we had before. This is kind of a fairly common thing, I think, in philosophy. And that suggests that the problem of the bad lot, if anything, is more serious, at least as serious in philosophy as it is in science. Okay, so moving on to the next problem, this is sort of less well known than the bad lot problem, more recent, I suppose. I call this the plausible rivals problem. Other people call it the disjunction objection. The problem here is basically that the set of available theories, this double struct T, that might contain several explanations that are, if not as good as the best explanation, then at least nearly as good. So there might be sort of some equality or near equality between a whole host of theories that are, jointly, they're sort of the best ones. And there might be one that's the best among those, but the other ones are only slightly worse. And in cases of that kind, it seems that since these theories are supposed to be rivals, which means that the truth of one theory implies that the other ones are false, the plausibility of each theory really undermines the inferability of the others. So it seems the fact that we have so many plausible theories, or nearly as plausible as the best explanation, suggests that we shouldn't really infer to even the best explanation. Nag, in a previous paper, discussed an example of this regarding theories of the origin of life, which are really quite speculative theories in a way, and some of them, or sort of arguably the most plausible ones, appeal to or posit that there was a sort of a genetic material that was kind of first responsible for creating life, but they disagree about whether that was RNA, DNA, TNA, or GNA. And then there's even an alternative that says that it was no genetic material at all, but it was really sort of metabolized in cells that sort of from which life originated, and genetic material came later. So the point is that these theories are all quite plausible. Maybe according to most scientists working on this issue, the RNA world hypothesis, as it's called, is the most plausible of these. But I think it's fair to say that scientists are not confident in inferring that that's the true theory, in part because we have these alternatives that are almost as plausible as the RNA world hypotheses. Now, this problem is most acute when there are many rivals. Of course, many rivals that are about as plausible as the best explanation. And it's going to be sort of a problem that's hard to eliminate when it's hard to obtain decisive evidence that discriminates between these rivals. When it's hard to obtain, for example, or do crucial experiments. So, this applies to the origin of life research because these are just events that happened so long ago that it's very, very hard to obtain. You can't really make any crucial experiments right now to discriminate between the RNA and the PNA hypotheses, for example. So we just have this kind of situation where, since we have many possible alternatives, and it's hard to discriminate between them with any sort of empirical means or any argumentative means, really. Now, what I want to point out now is that, unfortunately, this seems to be true of much or most philosophical reasoning as well. We're often in this situation where there are many plausible philosophical theories, and perhaps you think that one of them provides the best explanation, but it doesn't provide, heaps better or much better explanations than the second best explanation or the third best explanation, etc., etc. It's a more or less sort of equal playing field where maybe one of them stands up slightly better than the other ones, but that's precisely the type of situation as we saw in the origin of life example, where we should be hesitant, actually, to make any inference. Okay, so moving on to the third problem, I call this the problem of uncertain evidence. Also a fairly kind of recent problem, but it's sort of been pointed out fairly recently that you could have a situation, in fact, we do have lots of situations where it's not just that sort of there's uncertainty about what you should infer given some amount of evidence. There's also uncertainty about the evidence itself. The evidence in terms of IDE, or interest of best explanation, the evidence to be explained itself by available theories, that might be uncertain. For example, because the methods by which they're obtained might be known to be somewhat unreliable. Now, of course, some pieces of evidence might be more uncertain than other pieces, and different theories might explain only some of these pieces of evidence and not explain others. And we want our account of inference to the best explanation, presumably, to be such that if it explains a certain piece of evidence better than an uncertain piece of evidence, and that should count more in its favor than explaining the uncertain piece of evidence, all other things being equal, of course. Now, that's not what we have today. We don't have any really theory of interest to the best explanation apart from these references that I'm mentioning here, in which people are sort of sensitive even to this. So we want to somehow accommodate that and maybe perhaps hedge our bets when we have very uncertain evidence, even in interest to the best explanation. Now, this problem is most acute, of course, when we do have reason to think that our methods for obtaining evidence might be unreliable. If we are completely certain about the evidence that we obtain, we think that there's just no question about this evidence being misleading or anything like that. Then, of course, this problem just wouldn't arise. But when we do have some reason to think that our methods for obtaining evidence are unreliable, then the problem really comes to the fore. Now, what I want to point out now is that this arguably characterizes much of philosophical theorizing, especially, I think, when philosophical theorizing is sort of reliant on intuitions. So when people are sort of structuring entire arguments on the basis of their own intuitions or the intuitions of them and their friends, that's the sort of evidence that, at least, speaking for myself, I don't think that's a very reliable type of evidence compared to at least what the sciences are basing their inferences on. So I think we should be very, very hesitant to, we should be very careful about sort of, put it differently. So I think this problem is a really serious problem for philosophy because we have so much reason to think that the evidence from which we're inferring, if we even want to call it evidence, is quite uncertain to an extent that we rarely see in the sciences. We see it sometimes in the sciences as well, but we see it even more so in philosophy. Okay, so those are the three problems for really philosophical uses of IDE: bad math problem, the plausible rivals problem, and the uncertain evidence problem. And now I'm going to really suggest that these problems, they can be avoided. So it's not that these are unsolvable issues. But in order to do so, you need to kind of strengthen the standard version of interest to best explanation. In a way, you have to kind of replace it with safer forms of inductive reasoning, right? So remember, I made a distinction between interest to best explanation and inductive reasoning more generally. In inductive reasoning, there are forms of inductive reasoning which are safer than interest to best explanation. And what I'm going to be arguing is basically we need to replace interest to best explanation with these safer inference rules. And these are the ones, incidentally, that are more commonly used in actual science. So that's what we'll do. What I'm arguing now, so restoring glory to abduction in philosophy. And I'll sort of talk about this in terms of increasing the robustness of interest to the best explanation. And because I'm going to go over this part really, really quickly, because I don't have a lot of time, I'll just sort of mention these previous works where I sort of spelled this out all in much more detail with respect to abductive reasoning in science. But basically the same points will apply more or less to abductive reasoning in philosophy, in my view. So this is just if you want to check that out in some written work of mine. Okay, so in order to avoid the bad math problem, we basically need to ensure that the set of available theories at a given time, from which you're inferring that the best one is true, is likely to already include the best possible explanation rather than just the best available explanation with respect to the evidence. Right? So that's the way, somehow we need to ensure that if we're going to avoid the bad math problem. Otherwise the problem will just be there. So my suggestion for how to do that in a previous publication is through a sort of adding to inference to the best explanation of the standard variety, a process that I call explanatory consolidation. And so this is really a requirement that says, Well, if you're going to accept the best available explanation Ti among a set of available theoretical alternatives, you have to first go through a temporally extended process that consists, on one hand, of sort of accumulation of direct empirical evidence in favor of that theory, which, in a slightly sort of roundabout way, I suppose, decreases the plausibility that any alternative to that theory could explain all the evidence as well as that theory itself. Basically, because you have more and more evidence that counts in favor of your theory, and that just the increased amount of evidence makes it less likely that there's going to be any theoretical alternative, even in logical space, so even ones that you haven't thought of, that would be able to explain the evidence as well as this particular theory that you're hoping to accept. In addition to that, in this kind of temporally extended process, if you're trying to come up with alternatives to the theory, and you fail, then this accumulation of failed attempts to conceive of and formulate explanations that are better than the theory, that in turn also strengthens should strengthen your belief that the theory is in fact the best possible rather than just the best available explanation of the evidence. And in this previous work, I argue that this describes well actually many cases of scientific reasoning where scientists refrain from accepting a theory unless it's gone through this process of explanatory consolidation. Okay, so that's my suggestion for the bad luck problem. With regard to the plausible rivals problem, basically, in order to solve that, we need to somehow avoid inferring to anything that the most plausible rival theories disagree about. So think back to the theories of the origin of life. They will disagree about lots of things, and you shouldn't infer anything on which the theories disagree. However, that doesn't mean that you can't infer anything, because you can, sort of, without it being any kind of epistemic problem, you can infer what they agree on, what these theories that are rival theories and provide rival explanations of some evidence. If they agree on something, then you can infer that, and your inference is none the worse for it. So basically, if you kind of look at the diagram on the right here, if you have three theories in this case, they provide the best, the second best, and the third best explanations. And if these theories all imply a single claim C, then according to this kind of strengthening of inference-based explanation that I've suggested we can do, then you can infer that. And so I call this abductively robust inference. And never mind the precise definition. And so in the example of the origin of life, the hypothesis about the origin of life, the fact that the four most plausible explanations all imply that life originated in a nucleic acid, right? A PNA or a TNA or a GNA or an RNA. The NA part, that's implied by all of these theories. Then you can infer that part of the theory because that's implied by the four most plausible explanations of the available evidence. So that's a way of kind of avoiding the plausible rivals problem. And finally, and this is the most complex amendment, I guess, to or alteration to interest-based explanation in standard variety. In order to sort of avoid the uncertain evidence problem, we need to somehow hedge our bet when some of our evidence is uncertain. And so what I have here on the slide is basically a proposal for how you can hedge your bet in a way that doesn't require you to do doesn't require you to assign probabilities to the evidence in the way that you would in Bayesian or actually Jeffrey conditionalization. So this is what I call sort of evidentially robust inference-based explanation, and it basically says that, well, you require basically that the inferred claim is implied by each theory that provides the best explanation of what I call an open evidential combination. That's a subset of your evidence that has every certain evidential proposition as a member and none, some, or all of the uncertain ones. So basically, if you kind of look at this diagram, it's getting a bit complicated. But basically, you'll have, in a case where you have two pieces of uncertain evidence, you'll have 4 open evidential combinations. And if you have maybe different theories providing the best explanations of each open evidential combination, and then anything that's implied by all of these theories that provide the best explanation of some open evidential combination, that gets to be inferred by eventually robust IDE. And I think this can also be motivated, and I do motivate in this paper, this recent paper, that this is actually what scientists tend to do, at least in some cases, when the evidence is very uncertain. Okay, so to summarize, I'm not going over time. There's sort of good news and bad news here for the use of abduction in philosophy. The good news is that we can solve or avoid each problem for standard IDE, standard inference to best explanation, by really requiring abductive reasoning to be more robust in different ways. In response to the bad luck problem, I think we should require explanatory consolidation, which is an additional requirement on abductive reasoning. In response to the plausible rivals problem, we should require abductive robustness, which is also an additional requirement on abductive reasoning. And in response to the uncertain evidence problem, we should require evidential robustness, another additional requirement. So in combination, we can sort of summarize what this means, that we have to really replace this kind of simple, you might think powerful rule of inference to best explanation with a more hedgy rule, a rule that hedges much less powerful in a way, in the sense that it gets us less powerful conclusions. And it says basically this, that if after an extended period of explanatory consolidation, that's the first part, each available theory that provides one of the best explanations of some open evidential combination, if those imply the same claim C, then you may be used to be inferred by claim C. The details don't really matter so much as the point that once you replace IDE ST, so standard IDE, with this thing that I call now triply robust inference to best explanation, then you have a rule that's much safer, much more cautious, and therefore also gets you less dramatic conclusions. So that's really the bad news in a way, that by requiring robustness, or this triple type of robustness of abductive reasoning, that's either going to limit the situations in which abductive reasoning is applicable in the first place, or it's going to limit the strength of the conclusion that can be reached by abductive reasoning. So for example, just to illustrate, when explanatory consolidation typically requires waiting for more evidence and for more theorizing to have taken place, while abductive robustness, for example, requires inferring only what's implied by several of the best explanations. And that sort of weakens the conclusion that you're able to draw. In fact, in some cases, you might not be able to draw any conclusion from the evidence at hand. Now, of course, this is bad news only in the sense, or only for those who were inclined to think that the way philosophers actually argue right now, and have been arguing for the past decade, 2 years or so, is generally sort of in good standing. If you think the philosophy is doing, swimmingly, then you might think this is bad news, and should be considered. But then there's sort of those of us who have less of a rosy view about philosophical practice, that will instead take this to kind of explain actually why philosophical arguments are so toothless in many cases, and rather weak, and why philosophers, for example, tend to reach different conclusions from the same premises, from the same evidence, you might say. And so maybe I have some more slides about the upshot of this, but I think I might just end there to take questions instead. Thank you.
So thanks. We have plenty of time for questions, and we can begin with Lorenzo. Yeah, let's see.
Yeah, I can only hear, I guess.
Yeah, we have to move the microphone around. It'll be there in a second. If we can get it started. Take that one.
Thank you, Finnur, for the talk. I have a half funny, half provocative question for you. So you started off the talk saying that induction used to be the scandal of philosophy, right? Because it was the glory of science, and now we seem to have made progress in that respect. And you take this to be an inductive ground to believe that we are going to make progress on abduction as well, which is the glory of science as well as philosophy, even though we don't quite understand why it is the glory of philosophy. But here's come the provocative part of the question. So are we so sure that induction was the glory of science in the first place? I mean, we've been working on induction quite a lot. We developed sophisticated inductive logic and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, we seem to have agreed that induction, at least the way induction was conceived of in the 19th century, isn't quite what the scientists are doing. And so perhaps it wasn't the scandal of philosophy after all, because it wasn't the glory of science. Couldn't the same thing happen to abduction? I mean, perhaps you're preaching to the choir because most of us are scientific realists, so we do really believe that this is what science does, and we do really believe that it is what philosophy does as well, and even though we don't quite understand why, but we might wake up in a couple of 100 years and realize that neither science nor philosophy uses IBE.
I can respond, right? Okay, yeah. So let's see. I think, the main point of your question was sort of the last one, I think. I had those quibbles which said earlier, it doesn't matter, but I think the main point is, could just be the case that actually philosophers are not using abduction, and maybe scientists are not using abduction either. I think that's the main claim, and that could be true. I mean, I do wonder what philosophers are using if they're not using some form of abductive reasoning. This was kind of the point of the argument from the Tina argument, there is no alternative argument. I mean, what are they using if they're not using some form of abductive reasoning? And they also claim to be using it. So I would be surprised if they're not using something that we can characterize as abductive reasoning in a broad sense, right? What I do agree with, and then this might be your point, that they're probably not sort of really using like inference to the best explanation precisely in the way that that's formulated, because maybe what they're using is something kind of vaguely in the territory. I do think that they're not using a sufficiently cautious version of abductive reasoning, because I do think that I think I see a lot of papers that basically say, well, my theory is a slightly better explanation of this intuition that I had, and therefore we should accept that theory. I don't know if you've read as many papers like that as I have. I've certainly read many, and I think what I criticize IBE for is something that would really hit those kinds of arguments home, because I think the intuitions on which such arguments are based are not very, we can't be certain about that, so we should treat that as uncertain evidence. And B, I think the fact that there are only slightly better explanations, according to the authors at least, of these intuitions suggests that we really had to do a kind of an abductive robustness test, as I was talking about earlier. So I don't know. So I think even if the philosophers are not using exactly the intuitive best explanation, I do think they're using some form of abductive reasoning, and I do think they need to be more careful about this. I think, and for me, that's the most substantive issue.
Thank you. Finnur, you might perhaps better stop sharing. Then we see you better. And then Helen, PB.
No? No, now it is working. Yeah. Hello, Finnur. You're now massive on the screen. So I wanted to ask you to just say a little bit more about the place where you left off. So you kind of said, this might be a bit depressing for some people, but those of us who have a less rosy outlook aren't going to be, too depressed about it. So I wondered if you could just kind of give a little bit more of a sense of just how much you think abductive inference, given the constraints that you've put forward is actually likely to get us in philosophy? Is your view we are not going to get? I mean, I'm just, think about causation, right? Maybe we can get to, causation's kind of something to do with counterfactual dependence, or something. And it's like, that's not really rocket science, and doesn't get us a whole lot of progress, but it also doesn't get us any of the kind of theoretical sort of substance that most of us actually kind of care about when we're arguing with each other about the nature of causation, right? So just some sense of kind of like, have you got examples of cases where you think this has actually worked, or are you sort of generally skeptical about how much we can get?
Yeah, I mean, I try not to kind of go from examples, but I like the question. I think, actually I had a slide on this, I think, sort of about the way I put it is like, well, what's the role of the kind of speculative theorizing that we do in philosophy? I think that's another way of maybe asking your question. Like, so we are kind of coming up with all these theories there of causation, and should we just stop doing that? I mean, is I guess one question. And actually, I think not. I think and in fact, I think this kind of the conception of abductive reasoning actually gives kind of a distinct value to the kind of speculative theorizing that philosophers are doing, because in order to get to a point where you can be confident in making the inference that you in this kind of framework, you need to. The more you have explored the theoretical alternatives, the better position you're in. That's kind of the point. One of the points of explanatory consolidation, what I call explanatory consolidation. And so we need people to be trying to come up with theoretical alternatives. But it doesn't mean that we should immediately kind of infer that they are true. And I think it's a bit premature often to kind of present them as if they're things that we should infer by an inference to the best explanation. I think we should rather see these kinds of efforts as kind of efforts to come up with new alternatives from which we could then, perhaps at a future date, make inferences to something that all the most plausible ones had in common, for example. So that might end up something. I might end up kind of cautious, like the example you said of causation having something to do with counterfactions, but it might be more powerful if we get to a state where the rival theories that we deem to be most plausible, having explored a lot of theoretical alternatives, are such that they all imply a particular kind of claim, which might be something more powerful than what you said. And then we'd be in a position to actually infer that. But I think we should just be honest about what we're in a position to infer and what we're just speculating about. And I think the current situation is where philosophers are kind of pretending to be able to make from my point of view, they're pretending to be able to make inferences where it's really just speculation that we warranted in at the moment.
Bendik over there. So on my list, Bendik and Church, Ron and you, and then Yanni. So please keep the microphone on that side. Afterwards, I'll give my microphone here. Okay, Bendik. No.
Now? Yeah. All right, thank you very much for a great talk on an interesting topic. I was wondering about your view on evidence in philosophy. With regards to overcoming the bad lot problem, you mentioned the approach would be to accumulate more evidence. So what would be examples of good evidence in philosophy? And do you have an example of where one in philosophy has or could move from evidence to a theory choice? What would that look like to you?
Okay, that's a fair question. I'm trying to stay away from this issue of what counts as evidence in philosophy. I mean, I sort of mentioned in the talk, I think I mentioned just like scientific results on which you're basing your philosophical theory. I think you can't treat that as evidence in the context of philosophical inference. So, you're basing your philosophical theory in part on just scientific results from another field. But also, of course, then the big issue is kind of that you treat sort of intuitions or whatever that is as evidence. And I'll just sort of admit that I haven't sort of looked into that sort of enormous literature sufficiently well to have anything very enlightening to say about that, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I certainly do tend to think that philosophers are using something like what people call intuitions, and I also am quite skeptical about that having much of a role to play, unless they're very widespread, I suppose, intuitions, and very sort of there's no kind of debunking explanation for why it would happen, something like that. But yeah, I don't really have a settled view on that. Regarding where we can sort of move from the evidence to a theory, I mean, yeah, as Lorenzo was talking about, we're all scientific realists, and I guess I'm also a bit of a scientific sort of a naturalist in the sense that I think, you know, that the best cases where we can move from evidence to a philosophical theory are where we're sort of staying fairly close to the scientific theories and scientific results. I mean, because that's the evidence that I trust the most, right? So, I mean, I tend to think that, you know, when we're drawing, you know, philosophical conclusions from scientific results or scientific theories that have been, you know, are established in their field, I think then we're in a very firm footing. Less so, I suppose, in my personal opinion, when it's sort of we're basing things on intuitions. Although I don't want to dismiss intuitions entirely, because I don't have any expertise on that. So that's not very illuminating, but that's the best I have, I guess, to answer your question.
So now we have a question from Gerhard Türz.
Thank you. Thank you. I like your theory and your refinement of abduction very much. I agree with all of that. So my question, I think every one of your three refinements can be explicated also within a Bayesian framework. I mean, not that I'm now an ultimate defender of this, but I like, it could be given a probabilistic explication leading to an increase. You can show that all these steps increase the posterior probability. So my question to you, what do you think about? Because you, in the beginning, you stated an argument against Bayesianism, which I didn't get fully. So do you think that you can, are you friendly to the Bayesian reconstruction of this, or do you have some, do you see some problems here?
Can you just say which one of the three refinements you think could be sort of reconstructed in the Bayesian?
Okay, if you have something which is contained in all alternative explanation, then of course the probability will increase because it's contained in all of them. So the next, so if you have independent accumulating evidence, there's all these theorems about probability boost by accumulation of conditionally independent evidence connected with condensation theorem. And the third thing, I think a similar story can be done, but I don't have now exactly in mind. But these three things I think could be worked out.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah. So you mean each one of them could be sort of given a Bayesian justification?
Exactly.
And yeah, I actually, yeah, I agree. And I'm not hostile to Bayesianism by any means. I mean, I often use the Bayesian framework to in my own work. So it's not that I'm at all hostile to it, and I think if we can provide a Bayesian kind of justification for these rules, then all the better. I mean, as I sort of very briefly mentioned, so I think that in the scientific case, so where we're sort of just dealing with empirical evidence, I think, I just am a Bayesian. I think we should be. I mean, the ideal agent reasons in accordance with something like the Bayesian framework. But then I also think, most of us are not ideal Bayesians, and it would be terrible to try to teach every scientist and every graduate student in science and everyone to try to reason in a Bayesian manner and only support their theories in that way. So we need some way of kind of approximating the Bayesian ideals. And I basically think that, and this is one of the things that I've argued about, for instance, the best explanation and inductive reasoning more generally. We can think of it, we should think of it as a kind of a good approximation to Bayesian reasoning for sort of mathematically limited beings, and beings are not sort of maximally opinionated in the way that a Bayesian idealism would have to be. So if we can provide kind of Bayesian reconstructions for these rules, then all the better, because we should be able to do so if these rules approximate what the ideal Bayesian agent would do. Yeah, and then now my argument at that point in the talk was really just that it's really hard to see how you're going to do this for a priori reasoning of the sort that philosophy often involves. Yeah, so that was just what I was saying there, and I was also saying
You could have intuitions as evidence, no? You could have intuitions as evidence. Some people do that. I mean, my colleagues do it.
So you just I have a new intuition, and then I update my grievances in light of my new intuition that I just received from myself, kind of thing. I'll have to think about that. I mean, that's fine. I mean, I do have this kind of backup response, which is just basically that even if we did that, we'd need some way of approximating the Bayesian ideal. But that's I'll think about that. Please.
So here from Ron.
Hi, thanks. Great talk. I'm not sure anything substantial follows from this, but I just can't resist. Am I correct in thinking that your Tina argument, there's no alternative argument, either is or could be reformulated as a deductive argument?
I mean, it could. I mean, every argument can be reformulated as a deductive argument because you can sort of add a premise that says these are the only.
Well, let me.
Something like that.
Okay, I don't mean just in the formal sense. I think you were basically arguing deductively there.
I actually don't think so. I mean, I think because the premise that you need in order to create a deductive argument is something like these are the only 4 options. I mean, or let's just say if option A, B, and C fail, then option D has to be true or something like that. I think that's very obviously false, right? So you'd basically not have a sound deductive argument, and so therefore.
So even if you had defeasibility at the end, but anyway, I was just wondering. It just seemed to me that it wasn't. I didn't get the feel of it being an abductive argument. I just thought it was a little ironic. But maybe really the irony is just curiosity. It's not worth mentioning.
I mean, that's a good point, and I think so it's sort of a qualification to what I was trying to say in the talk is that I'm not saying that philosophers are not and should never be using these other arguments. For example, deductive. I mean, I think it's very obvious that we use deductive arguments. For example, in establishing that a theory can't be true. If you give a reductio of a theory along with some premises, then you use a deductive argument to do so. And various arguments, maybe even the argument that I gave could have been a deductive argument. I'm not sort of disputing that. But what I would dispute is that generally, when you're arguing for a general positive philosophical theory, of the sort that scientific realism is true, or non-Humean theories of laws of nature are true, or stuff like that, then I think you need something that is ampliative, because then you are moving from particular cases to a very general theory. Then I don't think a deductive argument would work. In the same way that a deductive argument for a scientific theory is not going to be much help. I mean, you can't argue deductively for a scientific theory unless you have, are already assuming theories that are stronger in logical sense than the theory for which you're arguing. So I didn't actually mean to, although I might have said that, I didn't mean to say you have to use, I mean, deductive arguments can't be used at all in philosophy, only that they can't be used to kind of establish general philosophical theories of the sort that they're often used to, that we often want to establish in philosophy.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question here, and before we just glide into what we'll call the panel discussion, where we'll just ask people to maybe start to comment more on general aspects of the conference rather than perhaps this particular talk. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a nice presentation. I would like to take you back to the explanatory consolidation bit. In social sciences, abduction is normally operationalized to map theories, not to find the best possible theory, but rather to get the picture of what is available there. I would like to hear some points of views from you for strategies of doing such a mapping, finding out the volumes of different genres of arguments available there.
Yes. This is connected, I guess, with the sort of the sense of abduction that Charles Sanders Peirce used originally. So he seemed to have been thinking about a method for coming up with new theories. Almost a psychological kind of method for Peirce, it seems like. And so I guess in contemporary philosophy of science, we usually talk about that as a logic of discovery of new theories. And I mean, I'm not sure I really have any strategies for doing that. I mean, it's sort of the, it's not that I think it's impossible. I think there's good reason to think that it's possible to come up with strategies, but philosophers in general have not sort of contributed much to this. In fact, some of them have thought that it's sort of impossible to have a logic of scientific discovery, because it's basically a psychological process, and you can sort of use any means at your disposal to kind of come up with this theory. You can just like think of something in the shower or do whatever you like, you know, in order to kind of come up with a new kind of theory. So yeah, I'm sorry, I just don't have much to come up with. I'm sure you probably are better placed to actually answer that your own question.